Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. So yeah, as already mentioned, let's keep the Q&A for afterwards. I will try to do my best to stay on time, to stay on track with timing. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we can see later on how to tackle them. So anyway, good morning. My name, I see some familiar faces. You know who you are, and then some other people first time. So who am I? I'm Bart Verboven. I work as a consultant since 2007. So I'm used to being on different environments, working on different environments. And I got an IT pro background. Since 2015, I've been working mainly on Azure, so basically exclusively on Azure even, assisting customers with both their security tracks, architecting tracks, migration, lift and shift, all those kind of things. Very, very broad in that regard. Since a while, I'm a freelance consultant. So you can find me at vicas.be or at my LinkedIn page if you have any questions later on. So also there, if your question today hasn't been resolved, do not hesitate to reach out to me later on, and we can see on how to resolve your questions. So today, what's on schedule? What's on the menu? First of all, I'm going to talk a bit about the security principles. So the focus, of course, will be on hybrid cloud environments. But it doesn't hurt, I think, to have first some ideas of what security is, or what exactly are we going to tackle, and what would be the key principles there. Then afterwards, we will translate those to some key pillars like identity, network, security operations, and then governance and compliance, to make sure that all the security principles can be translated into some technical aspects. Now, some disclaimer or some side remark there. Security, of course, it's very, very broad. It doesn't stop, of course, with just those pillars. Goes a lot wider than that. But yeah, we only got 1 hour, so there's no time to tackle everything. The focus for today will be mainly on the hybrid setups. So even if there's some security stuff in Azure that is, let's say, mainly focused on cloud, we will skip it, or we will highlight all the hybrid things. So there. So if you look at the cloud, or if you look at the road to the cloud, the customers, so most of the customers take, there aren't that many that go full cloud. So we notice a lot go or adopt a cloud first approach. They say, okay, we still have our investments in our data centers. We still have a lot of metal floating around that we still need to maintain. But we notice that a lot of newer workloads start to sneak in. So even if you still have an on-premise mindset, we notice a lot of customers, and Office 365, Dynamics 365 being one of the main drivers there, or for example, like Salesforce, cloud will sneak in eventually. Even if you go with Salesforce, typically you will see some automation, some kind of resources that still need to be built in Azure to make all those things happen, and all the data flows happen, for example. So my first message there is be prepared. So even if you are mainly focused on premise, be prepared, have governance ready, have all your security ready, and make sure that if cloud sneak in, that it doesn't become your shadow IT unsecure thing floating around. Make sure that it adapts to everything that you currently have. One of the main documents, or one of the main frameworks that you can use there is the Cloud Adoption Framework. It's on the Microsoft side, which gives some hints in how exactly you can focus on creating a landing zone, completing your identity, for example, and making sure that if new workloads come, that you are ready for them, and that you can provide a secure location for them. All right. So security principles. If you look at security, what are the main questions that you need to ask? First of all, the questions that you need to ask, they are not new to cloud. You should have asked them ages ago. But I noticed that when customers move to cloud, all of a sudden they think, oh, cloud is insecure. So we need a completely different approach, and we need to ask a lot of different questions, new questions. But that's not true. all the questions that you see here. So what are you trying to protect? Why does it need protection, and against who or what are you protecting it from? You should have asked those questions serious a while ago, and they also are relevant for the on-premise and for the hybrid world. So if you look at creating your baseline, if you are looking to create your security policies, ask yourself those 3 questions, because you will notice that you can't be 100% sure of everything. You need to make sure that exactly what are you trying to protect. For banks, it can be very financial information. But of course, if you have, for example, something in the social industry or in the social aspects, then of course you might have a lot of personal identifiable information that needs to be protected. Now, if you look at the specific protection or the specific vectors that you can take there, you have the CIA. So maybe a lot of you have already seen this before. But if you look at security or protecting your resources, it's very important to make a difference or a distinction between the 3 measures. Because, for example, confidentiality, some resources or some data is confidential, but for example, doesn't need to be available all the time. On the other side, integrity, it's important that those are consistent. To give some examples there, if you would look, for example, at NMBS, so the train department, if they got a database containing all the GPS locations of their train stations, is it considered confidentiality? Is it considered confidential information? I don't think so, because it's not a big mystery or a big secret where all the train stations are. On the other hand, for a bank, I can imagine that the exact budget or the exact amount of money that's on someone's bank account is slightly more confidential there. Integrity, same bit or the same thing. All the data needs to be accurate. We see a lot of breaches that are not only focused on leaking the data, on leaking confidential data, but also on harming and making sure that all the data that you currently have isn't accurate anymore. It's changed. And it's no longer valid. Can of course have a lot of impact regarding your public facing. Like for example, for that bank, you can say, okay, all the bank accounts, they're confidential, but of course you also want to make sure that no one can just tamper with it and just add a couple of millions to one of the accounts of your preference. So you need to make sure that, and it's a slightly different approach technically, you need to make sure that all the data is also consistent and accurate. That. And availability speaks a bit for itself. Also there, mainly the public facing can be very important, but of course the data, the integrity data, or the data that's integrity and confidential, you want to make sure that it's available whenever you want, and also available in a secure way. Now, if you ask these questions and you know, okay, what do we need to protect, and is integrity or mostly confidentiality an issue in our case, you have to line out and see on how you would approach all those things. And that's basically your risk management. It's a completely different topic on its own. So we're only just going to slightly touch it in this session. But basically what you would see is you have your risks, your threats, and you try to define them as much as possible. Typically you would get as an output your risk management matrix, where you would say, okay, these are the risks. Like for example, Russian people or Russians hacking our database. That's one risk. If it happens, what's the likely occurrence that it will happen? What's the impact? What's the threat? And what would be the impact if something like this happens? If you know, for example, that you're working with personnel that has been vetted upon their initial employment, you know, okay, the people we can trust, for example, and know that everything is, they don't have any rap sheets, so we know they are completely clean, let's say, they are trustworthy. Then of course the risk of them breaching things is a little bit different than when you have, like for example, kiosks in shops where everyone can just access it, no matter, no matter how safe they are. So it's very clear that you know what kind of risks you want to protect yourself from, and the event or what the outcome would be if something like that actually happens. Now, if you know those things and you know, okay, this is our plan, this is our goal, these are our crown jewels, and we will need to protect them against that, there's no just one magic bullet to it. If you would see on how you would take care of things technically, you always go as much as possible in your defense in depth. So I said there's not just one bullet. It's not just, oh, we got here one crappy application. We will just use HTTPS and all of a sudden we're good to go, put it on the internet, and let's hope no one will breach us. So defense or your security always have to be taken care of in a lot of different layers. Always assume breach that one of the layers can be breached and will be breached, and then just try to make it as hard as possible for the attackers to make it harder to get to the next level there. So also when designing your security and designing your technical environment, make sure that you make use of all the components. Don't just go with one. Say, hey, we're going to use or DDoS and everything is okay. No, just make sure that you have a clear idea of what's possible on the platform and then design accordingly. So of course you can protect against everything. So sometimes you have to make sure that you can avoid certain risks or you can just accept them. For example, the DDoS one is a typical example there. DDoS typically is DDoS protection is typically quite expensive. So you might, or some cases or some customers might just accept it. They say, okay, if someone will try to DDoS us, which is very unlikely, and even if it does happen, yeah, it's okay. We only got a small customer base, for example, or that application is not that much of a deal. So we can just accept the fact that at one point we might be DDoSed. So make sure that you cannot, or be aware that you cannot be 100% safe against everything. Now, if you look at the cloud, or why would clouds have some advantages there in security? If you would look at our traditional approach, so on the left, so on the left side, you would see how you would typically take care of it. You would have a lot of different parties. So typically you would have some vendors floating around in your environment, and everyone's just taking care of a little bit of their aspects or a little aspect of their security. They are being taken care of. But you will have a lot of black holes typically. Some server that still exists that nobody knows what it does anymore, and maybe it's just wide open on the internet. And who's owning it again? No idea, but let's hope it won't get breached. If you would see on the cloud enabled approach, you would see the shift mainly to the cloud vendor. So in this case, or in my case, everything to Azure. But of course, for AWS, for Google, is the same principle. You can just have a lot of clearer insight on exactly what kind of things you are responsible for and where the cloud vendor is responsible for. So if you would look at the next one, and if you would have seen any webinar before regarding or related to cloud security, you probably have seen this this slide before, where if you would see here, the gray ones, so it's a bit the same as the previous one, all the gray ones are being taken care of by Microsoft. So all the physical data center, physical host is being taken care of by Microsoft. So if you would look at the operating system, you would see there, if you would go on IaaS and on-prem, IaaS, so your virtual machines just running on Azure, you still need to be taking care of all the patching updates, things like that. So if there is an SMB1 vulnerability, please, you have to fix it yourself. In this case, with the SaaS and the PaaS components, you can make sure that the cloud vendor, Microsoft, for example, will take care of things. Now, if you would look at identity, it's a very important pillar. Sometimes you would notice the statement that security is the new, or sorry, identity is the new security perimeter. Have to be very careful that there's a difference between Azure Active Directory and the normal, the old school Active Directory as is. And the main differences here are, as you would see here, are the authentication mechanisms. The reason that Azure Active Directory exists is that Kerberos and TLM, it's not suitable for cloud use. In Active Directory, you would have a very clear defined perimeter saying that this is our domain, this is what we trust, everything else we don't trust. In a cloud perspective, you know that, or you can say that everything is trustworthy. So you need to come up with new authentication mechanisms. And for example, OAuth, SAML, and those things are cloud-ready mechanisms. Also, they're not going to dive deep into exactly what those are, but be aware that you just cannot use Active Directory on-premise. In a cloud-enabled world, you would look at strong authentication mechanisms. Also there, if you got, let's say your defense in depth, if you got APIs that just use basic authentication and put them on the worldwide internet, it's not all that great. Maybe you have to look at upgrading them or improving them to some cloud-ready and some future-proof authentication mechanisms. Typically, for Office 365 is being used, but also for the Azure portal, for example, you would look at Azure Active Directory integration natively. Some options there. If you would see, okay, how can we authenticate or what can we do regarding there? There are a lot of different options. I will get to a flowchart at the end of this chapter explaining things. But the main or the most important thing there is, are we going to authenticate against Azure Active Directory? So will that be our cloud? Will that be our primary authentication target, or are we looking at the on-premise Active Directory as is? So, for example, if you would look at ADFS, so the Federation Services setup, there are some specific use cases for that where it's still relevant. Where you know that you have integrations with on-premise applications and newer cloud native applications. So by the way, you will also get to the slide decks afterwards. So I will share with you the slide deck where you can see and dive more into the specifics of that. But else we will run out of time very, very fast. Password hash, same there. If you would look at something that's quite often mistaken, is that if you would set up some synchronization between on-premise Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory, typical case there with your Azure AD Connect, you could send up something like password hash synchronization. Also there, you're not syncing your passwords, you're just syncing the hashes of your passwords. And basically, they are even getting hashed as well. So if you would look at passwords that are available in Azure Active Directory, basically they aren't none, because you're still only hashing, or sorry, you're only syncing the hashes of those. So also there, take care of those. Pass-through authentication is a different mean or a different setup there, where you could just use Azure Active Directory and have some kind of pass-through authentication onto Azure on-premise. Now, why am I telling you all those options, or why are those options relevant? Because they are on your hybrid identity setup. They can be used for both cloud applications, but also for your on-premise applications. So as you would see later on, there are some options, for example, in integrating legacy applications and getting rid of all the Kerberos stuff, for example, and having decent OAuth authentication in front of that and exposing them like that to the internet. The federation scheme itself. So if we would look at how can we have some kind of trust and have some kind of relationship between our Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, typical case there would be our ADFS server saying, okay, if you authenticate against Azure Active Directory with a specific application, all the tokens or all the requests end up at your federation, where you can do some claim transformations if so desired, and then build a token and provide a token to the application there. So even if you would just say, hey, we don't need Azure, but we've got our Azure Active Directory and we got a federation setup, it can be quite, it can be quite beneficial to integrate those as well and have a look at integrations there. Like for example, if you would look at the Belgium, the FAS, so the Federational Authentication Services, they provide, for example, some services where you can integrate EIDs and it's me, for example, into an application. So if you build applications like this, and you would need stronger authentications than you can provide yourself or that you can build yourself, there are services for that one to have multi-factor authentication, things like that. Now, I realize there's a lot of information, and I said we had to go over things very, very fast, sadly. But what would help, or what could be very helpful for you, is this link, which provides you a flowchart in building or designing your hybrid identity setup. So, for example, you just go with the start and then see, okay, do you have Azure Active Directory? Do we trust it, or do we want to have it completely handled in the cloud? Like, for example, with the password hashing, or do we have other options? And then you can just follow the flowchart and see, okay, do we have password hash, or would federation more be something for me? I said you would get a presentation, so you would have for each of the endpoints, you will have some kind of pros and cons of those, and dive deeper into those and see exactly what they could do. But be very careful. It's also the first slide or the first topic in this presentation. Always start with your identity. Even if you're not going to Azure now, if you have Azure AD in some way or another, like for example Office 365, make sure that you have a clear understanding of the options that you have regarding identity and authentication, and design accordingly so you're ready for when the need arises, because it's very hard to retroactively change your identity design afterwards. So take good care of that. Now, one of the no-brainers, in my opinion, and that's still forgotten a lot, is multi-factor authentication. A lot of customers think, yeah, but we're on-premise, so why would we need it, or can we use it? And the good news there is that you can also use it on-premise. It's certainly not something that's only for the cloud. Even worse, it's also recommended to use on-premise. It doesn't make sense to have your Azure portal, for example, protected using MFA, and then have some Citrix environment on-premise that's not MFA capable, because they can just use that one to jump through your environment. So some concepts I think everyone already knows. The concepts of MFA basically is a combination between something that you have and something that you know, like for example, your passwords. When trying to adopt MFA, though, a lot of customers say, yeah, but we want MFA because it's a no-brainer. We know that it's secure, but it's quite annoying for our customers. For our end users, because then they always have to get their phone ready, and it's pretty intrusive because they always have to click or send that code. One tip there is always look at conditional access if you're going to roll out MFA to all the end users, because this way you can create some policies, you can create some rules stating when or whenever MFA is required. Like for example, if you have a device that's being managed by Intune, and you know that's a safe device because it has the anti-malware stuff on it and it's completely aligned with company policies, and you are in the company's office, which has the badge reader, and you know that's just not everyone's going to access, does it make sense to have MFA still? Depends a bit, of course, on the type of setup, but usually most customers say, if you are secure with a secure device on our secure environment, on a secure location, just skip MFA, we know that you're good to go. On the other hand, if you then just go out after work to the nearby pub and then log on with your device, maybe then MFA makes sense, and toggle it or only enable it then. So we can have conditional access being enabled and making it less intrusive for the end users and get them onboarded with MFA as well. Because usually it's not a technical thing to enable MFA, because there are a lot of connectors and also the most vendors support it. So that's usually not an issue, but the user adoption is quite, or can be quite hard if you're not looking at conditional access on that. So as I mentioned, if you're not looking at the cloud, or if you say I've only got some legacy applications, like for example, just a website that has been built ages ago using Windows authentication, for example, there are some options in the form of Azure Active Directory Application Proxy to enable pre-authentication in front of those. So you do not have to rewrite everything. You can just keep using the Windows authentication or even the basic authentication or Kerberos authentication on your application, and then put some form of pre-authentication in front of it in the form of the application proxy. The main advantage there is that it's also aligned with your conditional access policies. So all of a sudden, that's a 10-year-old application with Windows authentication, you can expose it externally using multi-factor authentication, using OAuth and modern stuff. So even if you say, well, we're not going to do something in Azure, it can always be very interesting to have all your on-premise stuff being exposed like this. Now also there is pre-authentication, so in the end, your end user flows will remain exactly the same as they were before. So no additional coding or architectural changes are required there. All right, networking. So that mainly covers, is a lot of information on a short time. Next to the next to the identity is networking the most obvious suspect if you would look at security, like saying HTTP, HTTPS, things like that. Also, there, if you design your infrastructure, if you design your applications or your environment in the cloud, also be very careful that you know the differences between, for example, EAS, so the virtual machines, and your PaaS components. Well, PaaS components typically have public IP addresses, and EAS is more isolated, bring your own IP kind of concept. I would strongly advise always to go on the reference architectures. As you could see here, this is just taken from the Microsoft documentation. Some reference architectures and seeing, okay, how can we create some kind of secure environment? Some of the components that you would see here, I will tackle later on. So don't worry about that one if you see some icons that you don't or that you can't place. But also there, networking on your EAS components, a lot of the responsibility, as you saw the blue lines or the blue squares, there's still some responsibility there for you. You need to be careful that all those flows go exactly as you want them to go. Like for example, if we would look at the security of your virtual networks, so the bring your own IP concept, perfectly isolated on a software-defined networking layer, you have to take or ask the questions to yourself, okay, what can we do and how can we protect them? Typical cases there, yeah, HTTPS all the way, for example, but also DDoS protection can assist there. And also you would see load balancing, but does load balancing have to do with availability, with security? Well, your availability can be quite important there. If you, for example, get DDoS or something like that on one device, you might use load balancing concepts to mitigate that kind of risk. Also, there, typical case that we still see, sadly, is your direct virtual machine access. So if you would do a scan, for example, completely on the internet on how many RDP ports are still accessible from outside, it's quite sad, really. There are a lot of machines that are just exposed widely on the internet. Yeah, make sure that you don't do things like that and expose them behind appropriate means. Also, their concepts, like you point to sites, connectivity, they all remain relevant. So if you got network security, network engineers in your environment or in your team, you can still, or they can still use their knowledge, their concepts to build your secure design or secure networking design in Azure there. A lot of the concepts still remain. So as you saw on the previous slide, concepts like your virtual firewalling or your web tiers, those still can be relevant in designing your environment at ASGs. So if you would look at how exactly can we make sure that the traffic is controlled a bit, it comes in a couple of flavors. The most easy one, and also there the no-brainer because it's a free one, are your network security groups. Just saying, hey, this machine or these subnets can only communicate over very specific ports, because as we often see, vulnerabilities have sometimes just to do with some kinds of high-end ports that are exposed, or things that are still available that shouldn't be available. So try to use NSGs, network security groups, as much as possible to limit your attack surface there as well. Network security groups, maybe it's somewhere here, it's all IP based, so that can also be quite annoying. If you say you got, for example, a bunch of SQL servers and a bunch of web servers, you have to know their IP addresses. So that can be quite annoying. And for that, you have your application security groups, where you can say, for example, all the SQLs or all those ranges, we just logically name them as the SQL tier, where you can build your rule set around names and tags, and not just IP addresses. Makes it a lot more insightful than what you normally have with all the IP-based things in those rules. So if you would look at NSG implementations, make sure or be aware that application security groups also exist, and that you can make use of those tags to move forward on that. Now, one step further, if you say all the NSGs, that's quite fun, but in the end, they are just access control lists. So they're just opening and closing ports. If you want to have more next-gen features, like a lot of vendors provide, Fortinet, Checkpoint, you name them, Palo Alto as well, they provide, of course, a lot more functionality than just opening and closing a specific port. So it might be interesting to look at those third-party vendors, what value add they have to your environment. For some, it makes sense. For some, it just doesn't. If you're completely pass-focused, for example, where all the security is mainly focused on authentication mechanisms, and all the flows are just internet-based or externally, then it doesn't really makes sense to make everything go through some virtual appliance. On the other hand, if you're in an environment that has a lot of virtual machines still, then it could make sense to have the same kind of setup and the same kind of vendor as well in the cloud as you would have on premise, to make sure that all the network flows are controlled there too. Now, if you say, but we don't want to have another virtual machine because we actually want to have as much PaaS components as possible, then the good news is does exist a component in Azure, being the Azure Firewall, that can be used as a firewall in between all those segments, with, as it is a PaaS component, built-in high availability as well. So you don't need to build load balancers and do some crazy setups with IP addresses. You can just have one PaaS component deployed in a couple of minutes. It's okay and good to go, and your security is all centralized there. So also main takeaway there, if you would go with EAS components, make sure that you control the networking flows between those components, either with NVAs, so your virtual appliances, Azure Firewall, or if those are too heavy or not required for your environment, just go with your NSGs. Depends a bit on the environment which of those makes most sense. Also, of course, from a budgeting perspective, while NSGs are free, Azure Firewall and certainly the NVAs, you come, of course, with both licensing cost and an operational cost. Now, if you have a combination between PaaS components and IaaS components. You have things like, for example, with your service endpoint, where you can expose the IP addresses of your virtual networks also to the PaaS components itself. So a lot of customers that I come across, they handle, for example, the IaaS components, so the virtual machines are being taken care of by the typical infrastructure team. So the system engineering team that all of a sudden have to do stuff in Azure. And then the PaaS components, the application team, the developers that are just developing on their own islands. And all of a sudden they need connectivity in between. And they need to make sure that everyone's aligned and everyone's connected. So one of those things could be your service endpoints, where you can securely create connectivity or create a shortcut basically towards from your IaaS components to your PaaS components. How this thing works, I added this slide of a block there, where you could see, for example, if you would not use your service endpoints, all traffic from virtual machines to your PaaS components, so for example, storage account here, would go all the way up to your Azure backbone and then float to your storage accounts. Also, depending on the kind of traffic that's on there, it might not be desired, because also external connections can flow there. What's a typical setup there is using service endpoints, where from your virtual machine, so from this subnet, for example, your service endpoints are enabled, you can bypass the Azure backbone and just go with Azure SDN, so the software-defined networking layer, and take the shortcut to the storage accounts, and also effectively disabling the red lines if so desired. So if you are in a typical IaaS PaaS setup, be aware that those things exist and that it could be very interesting to have links like that set up to make sure all the networking flows and all the data flows do not pass more or are secure and do not pass more components than they actually need. Now, one evolvement of that one, as you could see here, you still have a lot of traffic, slightly going out, even if it's on the SDN. The next iteration there basically are your private links, where you actually give PaaS components, like for example, your storage accounts, give them private IP addresses inside your virtual network. So you take it one step further and actually involve PaaS components inside your network, give them a private IP, and for example, the firewalling team or your networking team can make sure the policies are strictly aligned exactly as you would do with a virtual machine. So that's one iteration further, and more components in Azure are supporting this. Main advantage there also with your private links is that it's supported over VPN, for example, and over ExpressRoute, while your service connections aren't, for example. So even if you only have one storage account, in a typical case that you had at the customer is they had a lot of marketing data, so the typical large video files that they want to send over to Azure. If by using a private link, you can send them over the VPN, send them over ExpressRoute, and achieve higher throughputs or make sure all those flows are more secure than just going over the internet. Exposing your endpoints are going to go a little bit faster to make sure that we end up in time and have some time for the Q&A. Exposing your endpoints, so if you have, could also be for on-premise applications. That's also why it's highlighted in this presentation. If you've got some applications that you would need to publish externally, HTTP or HTTPS endpoints, go with some kind of application, a reverse proxy, as probably would do also on-premise. Some kind of reverse proxying to make sure there's a separation between the end user sessions and your actual backend pool. So it comes in the form of your application proxy, PaaS component, but of course it can also take the form of other reverse proxy vendors like Citrix ADC, for example, or Kemp, a lot of stuff, F5, for example, as well. Also there, look at your web application firewall. Could also be interesting if you have PaaS component. So I said you are is the shared responsibility. If you have PaaS components, so a website, for example, Microsoft will make sure that the underlying layers are protected. But in the end, you will have to make sure that the application itself is quite robust. Depending on the maturity of your development team and the code they deliver, it could be possible to have, or it could make sense to have, for example, a web application firewall in front of that, you're protecting you against the most common SQL injection attacks. Now, if you would look at the Azure PaaS component, it's mainly focusing on OWASP rule sets. So if you have got complete control over the development cycle of your application, and you know that code maturity is quite high, then maybe you can already have all the OWASP stuff or all the OWASP rules out of the code before it even gets in production. So that's the ideal case, but that's not always reality, sadly. So if you know that possible vulnerabilities can exist, certainly look at your application firewall. Also there, it's perfectly possible to use it in a hybrid setup. At one customer, for example, they had a cloud first approach, or they are going for cloud first, but they still got a lot of legacy websites. For that, we kept the backend of the websites on premise, exposed everything using the Azure Application Gateway, and then all the data would flow over your express route onwards to the on-premise data center. That way, we've got all our security principles and security best practices for cloud enablement, but still in the end, they can migrate on their own pace and refactor all applications on their own pace to more PaaS components and see to get rid of the on-premise one. So also there. If you are a globally distributed environment, you could also look at Front Door. We'll go into too much detail there, but make sure it's this one, layer 7 global routing. Basically, it has all the features of your application gateway, which I discussed in the previous slide, all the features of that, but globally as a PaaS service, and also a combination of your WAF, for example, so web application, firewall, and some CDN practices there as well. So just know it exists. Know it can also be used if you are on premise to make things available or expose them externally. Key Vault. Basically, if you look at how secrets are being handled in your applications or in your code, best practice, don't use any keys or don't use any secrets in your code. Certainly not plain text, but even encrypted, don't use them there. What Key Vault has there, or the main advantage there for Key Vault, is that you can centralize all the keys that you have, even certificates, secrets, like for example, encryption keys can be used there as well, or your tokens, and have a secure endpoint, have a secure REST API endpoint to actually access them. So for example, if you would look at a web application that has or needs to have access to certain secrets, don't just push them in the application code somewhere, but reference them to a Key Vault where only, for example, the application can access those secrets. And then you know, okay, that secret can only be accessed by the application and not just manual access. Also there, going to go quite fast over this one, but know that everything basically collapses, all your security principle collapses if you would use, for example, some of the components that we discussed in the networking and identity part, and then all in the end just have some plain password, or have some passwords in plain text just floating around in your code, preferably not on a public GitHub as some companies did in the past, because then of course you're quite screwed. So make sure that all your secrets, all your keys, could also be confidential access strings, for example, connection strings. Doesn't need to be the typical username password concepts. Are secure and secure in a Key Vault, and only be accessible from the applications that actually need them. Now, For the final topic there is your insights. So the first two pillars mainly focused on protecting yourself or making sure that your connectivity and your configuration is on point. But in the end, if you do not have any kind of monitoring, if you do not have any kind of logging, you're just going blind. So make sure that you have some logging. It's always the first step. Going in or trying to increase your security maturity level is making sure that you have exactly clear insights on what's going on. Does it make sense to have MFA enabled and then not log the use of MFA? Because yeah, if someone breaches the MFA concept or just steals your phone, for example, and does strange things with it, you are not noticing it. Also there, the architecture of your Azure monitor, which could help. Basically in the middle, you would see your metrics and your logging. Everything is centralized. It doesn't matter where the resources come from or the data comes from, sorry. Could be applications, could be operating system, could be custom sources even. So it could perfectly be your on-premise system. Also there, that's why I like to take care of it in this session as well. For example, customer on-premise has personal identifiable information on-premise. In a database, they put all the logs, all the audit logs on there, and then they create insights to it. Who actually uses that information? What's going on with that information? Who makes changes? And all of that, and then responds to it or make dashboards even to see, okay, what happens to that specific information. Also, yeah, with your GDPR compliancy, stuff like that, you need to make sure that you can detect breaches there. So always focus on your monitoring. Connected sources, yeah, they can all connect, as you would see here, VMs with agents. It's all agent-based, so you can use it on-premise, you can use it in Azure, you can use it on AWS, doesn't care. As long as it's a virtual machine with access to your log analytics workspace, you can centralize it and then try to make sense out of it. One of the things to make sense out of it or get some actual insights in those data is Azure Defender. Some say, or there's quite a bit of confusion what it actually is because it's an umbrella of a lot of different projects. I just added those two slides. So you have some idea that there is one for identity, for endpoint, for Office 365, and the previous naming, and also for the Azure Defender one. So if you would look at the components for Azure Defender, you would have, like, for example, the Security Center one, or the one that's called Security Center before. It's now called Azure Defender for servers. And then for SQL, you also have something. And also something that's not to be forgotten or not to be taken care of lightly is your IoT concept. So if you have IoT devices, they also need to make sure that they are secure. So also enable logging as much as possible there, enable auditing, and get insights in exactly what's going on with your devices. I'm going to skip a little bit here and just go over to this slide here. So you can just read the previous slides on your leisure after the session. But what I mainly wanted to say is here is that your security center, so your Azure Defender, gives a lot of recommendations regarding your compliancy or regarding your security posture. Like, for example, stuff like the service endpoints or the private endpoints and just PaaS components that are publicly accessible. They show up in a dashboard. So you're not just steering blind in configuring your Azure environment or configuring your environment as is. You get some recommendations there. Same goes, for example, using those agents that you deploy in your virtual machines. They send the data to the log analytics to your Defender. And you would also get some examples for, you will also get some recommendations, like, for example, hey, those GPOs, maybe you can disable them, SMB1, maybe it's time to also disable that one. So you also get some insights there. So certainly it's not just cloud only. Of course, the focus there, the focus is on Azure, but by using those agents, you can have a lot of recommendations and also increase on-premise insights as well. The next step even is to have actual insights in not just the configuration, but also in the kind of traffic that happens through the environment, and put some examples there as well. Yeah, that's the dashboard. So the secure score, Microsoft is also, you would also see this for the identity score, for example, is trying to give you some points. So you have some kind of idea of how good your progress is and how good your security baseline is, and try to increase that one as much as possible. So for example, if you do not have MFA, you would see that trying to, if you would enable that one, you would get a lot of, points, and increase your overall security posture. So it really helps a lot. See a lot of customers that using those scores, they have more insights on how well or how protected or how secure their configuration and setup actually is. So for example, you have vulnerability assessment, same with the SQL one. So for example, you see that excessive permissions are granted to public roles on SQL. I think it's even by default that's probably the case even by default. So best practice, shut them down or restrict them as much as possible. Really get some insights there. Also available for on-premise, not for the older SQL versions, but if you are reasonably up to date with your SQL versioning, you can enable your vulnerability assessments. You can enable all those insights, and even increase your security level or increase your security posture on your on-premise SQLs. So yeah, not just limited to cloud, also know it exists and try to get a lot of information out of that. Azure policies, and then I'm going to show some examples of what you would get using Defender, and then we can skip to the Q&A part. So setting, or what I often see is setting your configuration baseline, increasing your security posture once. It's not that hard. Just have a consultant like me pass by for a couple of days, and we can increase that secure score by a lot. But of course, you need to maintain things like that. It doesn't make sense to have all the IP address, the public IP addresses shut down, and then day after everyone just enables them again. So you can use Azure Policy to also restrict configuration changes like that, and restrict what actually can happen on your environment. Same goes, or this is now mainly focused on Azure configuration, but also there using those agents, using desired state configuration, you can have more and more control over exactly what kind of security or what kind of setup you would have on your on-premise environment, on your Windows VMs or Linux VMs there. Yeah, security center policy is basically just the same as the Azure policies, but then with the scope to security mainly. Now, to give some examples, and then to give some examples there. So what I would have, for example, with other customers, and that's something that you would never get without your insights. So also their main thing, get your insights ready. For example, on one of the VMs, somebody enabled had the Tor browser open. So yeah, not a good idea. You get that kind of information, for example. This one was sadly a successful brute force attack. So also there, he notices that a couple of audit logs, or in the audit, he notices a lot of failed attempts, and then all of a sudden, it was a successful attempt. So we decided that was considered to be a brute force attack. And then, yeah, if you see stuff like that, from oh crap, we have a brute force attack. What do we need to do? You can look at SIEM or SOAR, so securing or security information event management. So making sure that all those events that you have, they are properly gathered, centralized, and then security orchestration, automation, and response. Yeah, as the name implies, also respond to those. As time is quite limited, I'm not going into too much detail there on what exactly Sentinel is. Just know that it's very important that first of all, you get those insights and you have a response plan at the ready. Getting the data sources there isn't that much of a deal. So you can see it supports a lot of data, like for example, AWS, Azure AD as well. And it can also correlate to that. So if you would have, for example, 500 failed attempts in AWS, and then all of a sudden, and then it reaches the password, for example, and then log on to Azure Active Directory, it would still notice that one as a successful brute force attack because you first tried somewhere else and then on a different environment. So you can correlate between a lot of data connectors and also with a lot of different vendors. If you have multiple vendors on there, you can just get the data there in your Sentinel, get correlation between there, and then have some SOAR procedures ready saying, okay, we got our alert, it's probably a real one. What are we going to do? And how are we going to take care of things? So those are the workbooks and then some incidents on what happens. But I will give you the presentation so you can check those on how we can actually automate those things, because a lot of things, as I noticed, can be automated. You would see a lot of false alerts or false positives pop up, certainly the first iterations. You can automate those responses and then have some workbooks and make sure that everything is nice and smooth and you only get real alerts or get the real high severity alerts that wake up people at night, for example. Now, the key takeaways for today. So first of all, your identity new security perimeter as set. Design so accordingly. Do not assume that if your identity has been breached, that everything else doesn't really matter that much. Doesn't matter how well protected your website is over a superb HTTPS encryption and maybe even some backend encryption on the databases. Doesn't matter if I got your username and password. Multi-factor, no-brainer. There's still too many environments, too many applications that don't have it. Also there, doesn't make sense to have 100 applications MFA enabled and then just have one that isn't, because that one will be the one that they will enter your environment in. Networking, as I said, make clear that you know the distinction between EAS and PaaS flows. Try to combine them both with service endpoint and private endpoints, and prepare your landing zone. Prepare for the fact that there will be cloud resources at one point, and make it or try to prepare accordingly. Create your landing zone if the need arises, that you know where to create your private endpoints, for example, or how to exactly integrate your flows. And then, yeah, last but not least, the operation and governance. If you have everything set up, if you have your configuration ready, you have clear insights, know what to do know what to do if shit hits the fan, and get a plan accordingly. Also, there technical enforcement only goes so far as your Azure policies, for example. You can limit certain things, but you cannot limit human stupidity. There will be errors, there will be mistakes. Try to cover them technically if possible. Else you can also use contracts or use other user policies or something like that, or user agreements or whatever they are called, to make sure that everybody behaves and does it best to secure the environment. So still strict on the on the timing. So my apologies for 1 minute late. I got time on my end. I promised you some Q&A if you want. So I got time on my end. If you got time, certainly stay in this call. Else, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and then we can discuss or see in answering your questions.
Yes. Thank
All
you,
right.
Bart, for the presentation. I want to thank you first. And I hope everyone enjoyed it just like I did. And as we said at the start of the webinar, we have now time for a Q&A. So I see that someone has already asked the question. Nitin, I think. Can you see it, Bart?
Trying to find my way.
The
It's
chat is,
probably here somewhere.
yeah, it's uh, below.
Ah, here it is. Just Yeah, that's a very good question. So I'm going to put it right here, if that's okay. Is he still in the call? Yeah. There are some options, or it's indeed important that if you log, for example, certain events, like for example, the social security number that we did with another customer, that we want to make sure that we log that type of information, that either we try to limit sending that information as much as possible, if it could be possible, to just not send it over. Something that we also did is trying to scramble it, because in the end, sometimes it could be interesting, for example, to know that exactly which record it refers to. Like, for example, if you got the database with all the Belgians in it, we need to make sure that, for example, your or ID, we give a specific primary key, for example, to your record, and we know that this one refers to you. So in the end, if we would breach the log analytics, for example, we would just get another primary key. That doesn't make so much sense for the one that actually gets hold of the information. But can be used for the response teams, for example, to see, okay, ID1, for example, oh, that's you, or that's Bart, for example, and try and then dig deeper into those logs. On the other hand, you can also have your log analytics set up securely and make sure that not just everyone can access that one. You also have some options. I have to check exactly how deep they go to limit access to specific record types. So if you would, for example, have a security type, and then, for example, the social security ones, you put in different tables, then you can limit access to those tables, for example, against the IT administrators, and have only the security incidents visible or plainly visible. So there are a couple of ways to actually achieve it, and make sure that those are okay. Not sure if that's an answer to your question. With silence comes agreement, so.
He answered in the chat.
All right.
So I think the explanation was good. Okay. Does someone other have questions?
Yes, I have a question. First of all, thank you, Bart, for the presentation. It was really comprehensive, and it gave a good overview of security within Azure. I have a small question regarding the Azure Firewall. Let's say we're building a landing zone and starting out with a relatively small workload within Azure, let's say 50 to 100 hosts, and opting to go with Azure Firewall in the beginning. Would that make sense to, let's say, first of all, start with Azure Firewall, and in a later phase, after a year or two, migrate to a more enterprise-grade solutions like Checkpoint or Fortinet? Or would that be a great pain in the ass, and would it be advisable to start with an enterprise firewall from the start if we're aiming to get a bigger workload in Azure?
Depending, a lot of that depends on your budget, and also indeed the speed of the speed of your cloud adoption. Now, certainly it doesn't, or if you make the choice, for example, to not use a firewall at the start, you can always slide it in afterwards. The main advantage there is that all routing is being taken care of by the Azure platform. So the firewall appliances, whatever that may be, can only need to take care of the security policies. So if you would do something like that, a maneuver on premise, you would also have to completely rework your routing. And that's not the case, because with user-defined routes, for example, or what I did, for example, with another customer, is just set up the landing zone first. Also there, have a clear idea of your to-be situation. So if you know that we got, for example, some acceptance workloads, production workloads, it could make sense to have a hub and spoke design ready already, saying we will centralize all traffic at first point, not with a specific firewall appliance to it, and just use NSGs because, for example, that's only what the budget allows. and then in a later phase extend that hub VNet with the firewall appliance, and then at a certain point just route all traffic through it. The main problem with working with a solution like that is that you need to make sure that you know what kind of traffic is flowing through it. For example, if you know it's just a website or something that you developed and everything is over HTTPS, you can just slide in the firewall and open port 443 and you're good to go. If of course that starts to lead its own life, then it's quite hard to restrict or build your rule set from nothing. And in that regard, your firewall appliances usually have some more insights on exactly the logging. For example, you can say, I know for checkpoint, for example, you can first allow an any rule. For example, enable extensive logging on that one, see what actually comes through, and then start with a specific workflow, trying to limit that as much as possible. Takes a bit of iterations to get all the rule base good. Azure Firewall is a little wouldn't say going in blind, but it's a bit harder to actually tweak the firewall rules afterwards, in my experience. So you can slide it in perfectly, but if you then would build the complete policy set from scratch, can be quite cumbersome. So is it actually needed from the start? No. Is it advisable if you got the budget for it? Then I would certainly propose so, because then you can organically let the appliance and the rule base grow with the rest of the environment. Else you probably have to do a lot of, it's a heavier project to move it in later, but it's perfectly possible.
Okay, thanks for the answer.
All right, thanks.
Or is everything clear? I think there are no other questions, Bart.
Okay, perfect. Then we can release everyone for lunch. Thanks a lot for your time. I assume, Valerie, you have all the contact details for those interested in the slide deck. So with that, comes my contact details. So thanks a lot for your time. If there's anything else that all of a sudden pops up during lunch, don't hesitate to reach out. And thanks for your attention.
Yes, thank you all for entering this webinar. And who is interested, I want to, we will share the presentation afterwards. So yeah, thank you for your, for entering the webinar, and I hope to see and speak to you soon.